This discussion traces the evolution of Nzinga Soundz from its inception in the mid-1980s to the present time. In their interview, DJ Ade and Junie Rankin talk about their early musical influences, their political activism, their key achievements and challenges, and their role as disruptors in this UK sound system space. This podcast is an edited version of an oral history interview with Reid and Lynda Rosenior-Patten of Nzinga Soundz via Zoom in October 2020.
Junie and I met age 11 when we began school, secondary school at Norwood Girls' School in West Norwood in Gypsy Hill. So we've known each other 50 odd years. I come from a Sierra Leone background and June comes from a Jamaican background. And our fathers were massive jazz buffs, had a really passionate interest in jazz. We'd have regular gatherings and get-togethers, not dissimilar from the Caribbean, West Indian get-togethers. And I was always just interested in being around Sierra Leoneans, especially when they were speaking in Creole, and I just wanted to be part of it. And the only way you could get licensed to be in that space was by making yourself useful, either serving your aunties and, in my case, opting to play music. And so when June was around, she'd be helping me out. So that's really how I began playing, with June assisting. People get to hear about us and say, "Oh, Lynda, do you out in Creole? Do you play some music for we, no?" And I would say, "No, fine," and volunteer. And then the Gambian cousins, because I've got Gambian cousins and cousins all in different parts of West Africa, so they would ask us to play. And so it went on from there.
And then Lynda and me helping her play at the family things, then people started to ask us to play at weddings and parties and so on. And it became so frequent that we thought, we've got to start to get our own equipment. We got Dada Imarobe, who was working with me at Chedo, and brother Ken Yahweh McCullough, who the artist, to help us go and select equipment. So we had everything except for speakers at one time. And we would hire the speakers from, was Lynda?
Called Serious Music.
Is it Serious? In Islington. And so, we'd play out to 1 o'clock in the morning. And then after a couple of hours sleep, I'd have to drive the boxes and return them to this company. We had a very good relationship with them, and, they looked after us. And then we just thought, it just makes sense to get our own speakers. And we got a couple of different sets of speakers, again, with Ken helping us. And so, we were fully fledged sound. And in addition, we did community radio on what was SLR radio as well. And we had a 3-hour sort of magazine show. But to go back to sort of playing out, it just went from there. So, we played at parties, we played at weddings, we played at namings. We've played abroad at a wedding in Barbados. We've played in Paris last year, the Paris Londres event. We played at the very first Windrush celebration at City Hall, where Daddy Odie was comparing, and we were alongside artists like Sister Audrey and Carol Thompson.
We fast forwarded a bit. So between school and becoming a fully fledged sound, there was the time that we were at university together, and that was again a good testing ground, because we would have frequent parties, and obviously there was a crowd, and it was really a party crowd. So we were able to sort of hone our skills in a very kind of safe and comfortable environment. Obviously, we left university early 20s and got our first jobs during the Thatcher years at Virgin Records. I ended up being a buyer there purely because I was so bored being the cashier. I was probably one of the most miserable cashiers you ever came across, because my political kind of leanings and my passion saw myself as a Pan-Africanist, very much community orientated, a community activist. I volunteered to take on the responsibility of developing the African music section and the world music section, and also had responsibility for reggae 12 inches and soca and calypso 12 inches, which were big. The 12-inch whole kind of phenomenon was big in the early 80s. And so through that, built up relationships with key suppliers and buyers.
I was buying records, Our Price and all these other places, and places in Brixton and in Peckham, Band Music in Peckham. But anyway, I ended up at the mega store, and I asked for the manager, and I can still see myself sitting at the table with him. I'm explaining, just finished uni and looking for a job, and he was quite clear. you're not going to stay, so I'm not going to appoint you. And I just basically must have persisted and persisted and said, I will, I will, I will. I started as a cashier. There was 2 black staff there, both male. One was Trevor, who was a security guard, and one was the cleaner, and that was it. I was the first black person in the shop that wasn't either a security guard or a cleaner. And then, obviously knowing Lynda, and both needing a job, brought her in. She had her interview.
Because of my African background, and also thanks to my dad, because he was apart from being a music buff, he was very much knowledgeable in African music generally. And also when we were having these house parties, family parties, because we lived in Brixton, so he would go into Brixton Market to buy his fish, buy his rice, whatever, to pick up whatever latest tunes, including a lot of tracks coming out of Jamaica. So there was an eclectic mix of music that I was exposed to. So I carried that passion into Virgin and really kind of jumped at it because I knew what I was talking about. No one could bother me. Through that process, I was able to identify suppliers for Virgin who had never before had a relationship with Virgin. And obviously, during that time, it was the boycott of South Africa. But I purposely felt that, in terms of African musicians, we had to sort of have a reverse attitude to it, because it was about giving voice to the musicians who much of their music was about the struggle and about their experiences. Again, it was unbeknown to me. I was just passionate about that. I wasn't really setting out to make any kind of economic impact. It was really about injustice, as I saw it, and the brilliance of a lot of these musicians. Through that process, established the African section. At that time, WOMAD was on the rise as well. So it's about the whole thing about world music. We had a very strong relationship with Jetstar, because Graham, who was one of the key salespeople, would come with his Jetstar van packed full of, the latest records, park around the back of Oxford Street, and we would sit for hours, oftentimes go AWOL, and no one would know where we are. And we'd be obviously pulling for the shop, ostensibly buying for Virgin, but really kind of just, expanding our musical knowledge and picking out stuff that we liked. So so that was a really kind of exciting time. And of course, oftentimes I'd go to Jetstar, look at their latest releases, and that's how I met Mr. Palmer and his staff there.
You can touch on your relationship with Jumbo and Stearns as well.
Yeah, so they were 2 key African suppliers of music. And don't forget, in terms of the reggae scene in particular, it wasn't African musicians not just playing indigenous African music, but some of the important labels coming out at that time were Gallo Music, Stearns Music, which was a small shop near Good Street, a connection with a guy called Charles Eastman, who was both a musician and he was also a member of staff at Stearns. And so he, with a guy called Robert, who's the co-founder, I think there's 3 of them that set up that small, but it kind of was really much punching above its weight, because then they were very knowledgeable about African music and had a really kind of up-to-date and extensive selection of African music. And again, it was a fertile ground of get to know about different genres and establish those supply links where they were able to supply Virgin, which they had never done before. We would be playing with Sister Culture, for one, was a pioneering DJ and sound woman of the town and very much a roots specialist. But there would be times where we would play with Sister Culture, kind of like in a roots rock reggae sort of dance hall setting. And then we played with Rita Ray, who was one of the leading African DJs at the Mambo Inn at Five Ways in Loughborough. And again, a very popular club, a lot with the WOMAD club, the WOMAD crowd, kind of quite knowledgeable. And we'd also played at concerts where headline bands like Papa Wemba. It was about us as contemporaries coming together, having a very similar passion for music.
So we played music from around the continent. We would play Latin, we would play jazz, we would play soca, calypso, reggae with its roots or lovers rock, soul. Both our combined experiences meant we could span all that.
Abdullah Ibrahim.
Yeah, artists like that as well. My mum was also into music kind of separately. She had more of the religious tip. So she liked Jimmy Reeves, as the Syrians call him. Yeah. Jimmy Reeves to the Jamaicans. Pat Boone, but as well as Solomon Burke and Brooke Benton. So I grew up hearing all of that. And I was a very clingy child, God rest her soul, but I was terrible. So where I should be in my bed being looked after by a childminder, I can still see myself now at this. It must have been a house party, because I could steal myself, and I'm obviously the level of people's knees, and I'm clinging around their legs. So, so on a Sunday now, where the pirate radio station will play some of that stuff, I know it, and it brings a tear to my eyes, because a lot of that generation is gone. Whether it's my mum, whether it's my dad, whether it's my godmother, all that generation are gone, and it's their children. Like, for example, my godmother's got a daughter who's 80, so it's that generation now that's there. The older ones in their 90s and they're close to 100, they've gone. And that's how we could bring that eclectic range to our playing.
I think it's important to remember the mothers, because it's kind of those parallels communities, immigrant communities had, Black immigrant and African communities had. There was a lot of commonality in the music. There was a shared kind of very strong religious convictions, and coming from backgrounds where faith was very important. Part of what our legacy will be is that it's ensuring that all of those influences and all of those contributions by our parents and our forebears, you know, are captured. It's part of our journey. So, for instance, when we played in Paris last summer, never been to Port Doré in the suburbs of Paris. Massive audience on a hot summer's day, outdoor venue, very visible, no place to hide. We thought we were just going to play a couple of hours in between the main acts. We had the honour to be there with BBC Seaton. It was a whole fantastic weekend of music and history and culture, celebrating 1962 to 1989, an era of music, what they meant to immigrant communities in Paris. And we were able to draw from our knowledge of music and satisfy a crowd who we'd never played for before. At the end of it, the crowd didn't want us to go home.
We grew up as children of the late 50s, listening to Tom Jones, Dusty Springfield, Lulu, all that people, because that's the choice we had. In the background was the stuff coming from America of the 60s and the 70s. So you had Aretha, Marvin, Percy Sledge, Staple Singers, Otis Redding. Yeah. And then stuff of our time now would have been ABBA, Rod Stewart, and then more recently, like Ed Sheeran. So all of that, we can go somewhere and play all of that pretty comfortably. You know, I remember playing at a 50th birthday, me and Lynda playing at a 50th birthday party in Charlton about 2-3 years ago. That was a predominantly white audience, but we had them rocking till, I don't know, from what time to what time, you know, good 5 or 4 hours, because we were able to play, you know, the 60s and 70s in terms of the soul music that they grew up raving to. But we also were able to chuck in, like we say, the Abbas and the Rod Stewarts and all of that stuff. I developed a relationship with band music. Brother Michael Fontaine is still running the shop in Peckham. First of all, they didn't take me seriously because I was a woman coming in buying music. It was typical of the time, must be 80s stroke 90s. And obviously, it's a Saturday morning and the counter was full of men. And initially, they didn't take me seriously till I started buying £100 worth of records one time. And then they started to, before I got into the shop, they would start to pull out stuff for me to hear. And they knew, do not select anything that had any misogynistic, batty rider, what they're going to do to women. Yeah, they knew that I didn't play that, didn't buy that, we didn't play that rather. And so we had a duty not to play that stuff. And occasionally when we played something and didn't realise what the lyric was, we would get challenged. And in some ways it felt a bit unfair because other sounds didn't. And also when men wanted to come and nice up the dance over our set, the volume to the microphone would go down. If Lynda was nearby, she would politely explain to them, no, thank you. I would give them the look. And in my look, it's basically, go on, take away yourself. And I was that harsh because they wouldn't do that to a man. They wouldn't, a men's sound, they wouldn't come up and take the microphone that might be lying idly by and start to nice up the dance. But they thought they could do it with us because we were girlies. Bojangles in East London, where the guy who was like the DJ for the night, the MC for the night, he was like a young guy, could have been our sons. And he was kind of being a bit disrespectful. But then when we started to play the vinyl raster, and it was vinyl before he was born, yes, big up Nzinga Soundz, and they're playing vinyl, you know. Everybody else, except for Dubplate Pearl, I think, everybody else was playing on their laptop. All the other guys were playing on their laptop.
Whilst we're being held at a higher standard, simultaneously, we're not expected to be successful. There's definitely a paradox in there, and I think I'm still trying to work out exactly, you know, what it is. It's the reason why it's nuanced. It's far more nuanced for us as women, and then about versatility. I personally don't know of any other sound who can play for a dedicated Gambian audience, Gambia/Senegalese audience. Whilst at the same time we had a lot of success with a dedicated Eritrean audience because of our approach and because of our political positioning. We're women, we're diverse.
It's like we're held to higher account, so we mustn't play anything slack. And both Lynda and I recall being at Yar Santua.
May have even been the factory way back before it was Yar Santua. A particularly aggrieved woman who, you know, couldn't really just get with the fact that women were controlling the set and controlling the music. And she literally complained about Stick By Me. And we said, let's play it again. Can you hear anything, Jim? The record was slack. Oh, for goodness sake.
And I remember we played at a 60th a couple of years ago. The guy asked us to play, it was his 60th, and there was lots of disgruntlement going on. And I was thinking, you're sharing it with him, but you're not coming and asking us, can we play this or play that? And again, it was clear. It was because we were two women, and they were used to men playing in a certain way. So when they weren't getting that certain way, they were more or less, I think, rubbishing us.
There's interesting dynamics that are going on that maybe need further looking into. Different things happen in different spaces because of different dynamics.
The microaggressions that we get, really, very interesting. We get a different vibe from a different audience.
What happens when you bring together women who have had a lifetime passion for music, an eclectic and open approach to music, women who relate to the struggle of African people and have been actively involved in the struggle and impacted in a positive way how we as a community can respond to the challenges of the struggle. As we grow older, we become mothers, and that whole kind of empathy and nurturing thing comes into play as well. All of these things I think are relevant, but I've never had the chance to really sit down and study it. And the reason why I say that is that going back to those times when we've been in a roots reggae, dance, conscious people, all black crowd, and I say, let's drop an African track. Let's just try it and see how we go. And then years later, we've got a whole stock of, favorites that people come to us to ask for. To me, that's massive. That's really massive. And I'm not saying it doesn't go on anywhere else because I don't know it. Maybe it does go on anywhere. I'm talk about my journey, my experience. We came up in a particularly buoyant political landscape. There's so much going on the world politics scene. The struggle of Black people has always been there, but I was very much aligned myself with the Black consciousness movement, and I felt I was a Pan. Then having worked very closely with some of the exiles directly from South Africa, it puts a different spin on things and becomes real. We were involved in, as part of BALSA, Black Action for the Liberation of South Africa, we were actively involved mobilizing around how we can raise funds to pay for prosthetic limbs for people who are victims of landmines in Mozambique. And this is pre-Diana, when she was doing her walking back with her mask. People were just sitting around in back rooms, stuffing envelopes, fundraising, organizing for those kind of things. So these are all things that informed my approach to music. I'm very much interested in the international audiences, and people seem to be interested in what we're doing. So we have to make how we work on those platforms, the modern platforms, how we can make it relevant for us.
The only thing I would add, and Lynda's totally right, because what's been great for us, even in this discussion we've touched on things in a different way than we've done previously.
In terms of, you're saying the current landscape and how that looks for female DJs, female practitioners. One thing that we would advocate is that the need for women to interface in different ways, because it's almost like it needs to be a catch-up. We've been there doing it for a good, lifetime, and yet still we're in 2020 only now beginning to thinking about documenting what we've done. And I suppose we have this reticence about not wishing to big ourselves up, but what we have done is really seismic. It's what we've contributed in terms of the length of time and the interventions, how we've worked with Virgin and Obala and worked with a lot of early dub poets. All of this has helped enrich what we do. And so it needs to be documented. So part of the advice to females coming up is, to do your trade in different ways, not just play into music, but talk about it, publish papers. We need to sort of create this critical mass of information that, really refutes the thing that we don't exist.
In Sonic Vibrations, the patriarchy and sound system culture that Nzinga Soundz experienced as a female-led sound system is further discussed in Sisters in Sound, a conversation on lovers rock and sound system culture.